Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you might be. This is Cloud Unfiltered. I'm Nikki Acosta, your hostess with the mostest, and I've got a really great guest with us today, our very own Ken Owens.
Hey, Nikki, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to being unfiltered today.
Yes, and a much thinner Ken Owens. I couldn't believe it. I hadn't seen him in a while, but I was like, man, Ken looks fit. Good for him.
Yeah, it's amazing what not traveling as often can help you with.
That's where I usually get tripped up. I find that being on the road, it's really hard to eat healthy, especially when there's just so many good things you want to eat and regional things and people you want to go eat with. But let's get to it. We typically start out by asking, how'd you get to be where you are today? You've obviously been in technology for a long time, but take us back to when you were younger. What were you like?
Yeah, well, as a kid, I always liked to break things and then try to fix them. And so, my parents always had me out of the house trying to fix other things besides things that I break in their house. And so, engineering became very natural to me. I loved doing engineering, went to do electrical engineering, and sort of started off my career doing sort of like telecommunications and some of the early days of ATM and frame relay and the convergence of the two, and then move into MPLS. And so moved from a telco to Tel Labs, where I was like building routers and switches, to a startup company building network processor ASICs and switch fabric ASICs, to sort of when the economy crashed, moved into IT. So I kind of got background with an enterprise company working at 2 different banks and sort of leading up architecture and engineering within the bank environment. And then when an opportunity in St. Louis opened up with a hosting provider called Savvis Communications, I jumped over to Savvis and spent a lot of my early cloud days and kind of cloud computing and platform as a service type of efforts at Savvis, and then moved over to Cisco to do intercloud. And everywhere I go, I sort of keep the same theme of focus on customers, focus on what their needs are, what they're looking for, and try to stay as connected to them as possible, to their needs and to what they're looking to accomplish, and then organize your teams around speed and focusing on execution and delivery, because my motto is working code will outbeat a PowerPoint anytime. And so I try to make sure I live by that mantra and have running code for demos and not just a bunch of PowerPoints.
Ken, one thing that I think is really sort of fascinating about you is you've managed to kind of work on, I'll say, kind of traditional infrastructure, and now you're kind of like this guy who's like at the bleeding edge of technology. I know that that you work with our DevNet team, but you're also a technical oversight committee member, correct?
Right.
So
yep, that's correct, on the CN Cloud Native Computing Foundation.
And what is that foundation? What do y'all work on? What do you do?
So in the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, about a year ago, Google was looking at taking Kubernetes and open sourcing it, and they weren't sure exactly the right way to do that. And so they worked with the Linux Foundation to put together a Cloud Native Foundation, where Kubernetes is one of the many projects in the foundation today. And the whole concept around Cloud Native is the industry is confused. There's so many terms and so many ways you could say something is cloud native, and over the years the confusion just seems to keep growing in the way terminology gets thrown around and open source projects take off and mature. And so the goal of the Cloud Native Foundation is to help define what cloud native means. There's an executive steering committee that Cisco is one of the founding members for. And then there's a group of technologists that were voted in by the community at large as to individuals that should represent what the technical aspects of cloud native means. And I'm on that technical oversight committee.
So what kind of things do you get to make decisions about?
In the first year of the foundation, it was really about defining what we want the foundation to do. And so the first decision that we made was we're not going to allow to happen to cloud native what happened with like OpenStack and with like other projects and other foundations in the Linux Foundation, meaning that we don't want to create a big tent or create a bunch of projects that people go off and develop their own technology. What we wanted to do was sort of say there are multiple ways to accomplish cloud native solutions, and there are multiple projects that are having success in the enterprise space doing that. And so let's go talk with these companies and these projects and say, here are best practices and things that have worked for these enterprises. Here's how you should try to start about this journey towards cloud native. And we'll get more on that journey later, but the whole aspect of, let's start with what's popular, what's getting adoption, and what's being successful, and let's kind of build a foundation around that ecosystem and try to help enterprises and users understand how to go down this path and give them some support as they're going down this path. So that's kind of the first decision we made. The second decision, and what I've been involved in, is bringing projects into the CNCF. And so I work closely with the container networking interface work group. They've defined sort of some very basic primitives around what you should expect from your underlying networking interface for cloud native. And so we brought CNI into the CNCF as a project that's part of our foundation. And I'm working with other projects across the industry right now to look at how do we support them? How do we bring them into cloud native foundation? Do they make sense in the foundation? Do they meet our criteria for what we want as a project in the foundation? And so I spent a lot of time working with individual projects and talking with users of cloud native technology to understand and help determine what direction we want to take the foundation.
So what is CNI in a nutshell?
So CNI in a nutshell is just an interface specification for how do you, request a network interface, how do you assign an IP address. If you're familiar with Linux commands, it's very similar to, if interface up and, do netstat-nr and you get, the routes for the container network, right? So it's basically taking some of the very basic primitives of a networking interface, defining your gateway, defining your DNS, defining your, your net mask, right? So the basic, IP configuration list. And it starts with that, just sort of making it so networking individuals or developers can understand how to request a specific IP address or request a specific DNS server to be their DNS server.
So in Cisco, from like the Cisco viewpoint, obviously Cisco is a company that has its roots sort of in networking and in a lot of ways define the space around networking. But what do you see between, I'll see Cisco's sort of traditional product lines and sort of moving to this, container networking model? Like what advantages does it have over some of the more traditional networking models? Yeah,
well, definitely. I think there's two ways I like to look at that question, right? The first way is depending on the use case, traditional networking is what you have today, right? And so in most cases, I don't really see it as an advantage or disadvantage. I see it as an integration point. How do you take on a containerized environment into your existing network without rewriting how networking should work, right? And the example I like to give is when everything is working well and you have no problems, you don't care where your container lives or your services live, right? But in the real world, things break and things don't function the way you expect them to. And you need to know where that service is that just went down, because your other services, while they're loosely coupled and don't require that service to be available, you can't create new services without that service, right? And so you have to kind of, to some extent, you have to kind of understand what is happening at that underlying network layer, whether it's an overlay network or a physical network. You want to have visibility into that underlying infrastructure layer. And so you want to kind of extend your existing networking capabilities into this container space if for no other reason than to just have a better view of what's happening. The second aspect is really important to your question, right? Why containerize? Why look at cloud native, right? And I think there's two ways that I like to answer that question too. The first one is, as you look at structuring your application and the way application availability is so critical today, and your reputation sits in a lot of times on the way that application behaves and performs, right? And so cloud native and just containerizing and breaking up your monolithic application into multiple independent services that can all be run and maintained and distributed independently of each other and scaled independently of each other, right? Allows you to be much more reactive to your customers, allows you to be much more available and get your uptime a lot higher, and allows you to, in a lot of ways, abstract yourself from that underlying hardware or services that you're buying from a provider, right? Because you're writing your code at a sort of a function level or at a service level that doesn't require any underlying definition of hardware or services from a provider. The other aspect of that I think is important, especially with the networking question you have, is when you're connecting your services together, you don't want to have to train people how to do some kind of new network model or some type of a new network way of doing things, right? And you don't want to make it so somebody has to stop and think, okay, I need an IP address. How would I configure an IP address for a container? And then make them go off and type commands that have no like reality in what the rest of the world does today for networking, right? And so I think it's really important that as you look at developing containers and microservices, you want that networking to be consistent with what you would typically do on any sort of a Linux device or a Windows device today, so that it's familiar to you when you go to type in those commands. And that's why I think if you keep those two views in mind, you're extending your existing network in a way that makes sense for your developers and is similar to what you would do for any type of a networking configuration today. That's why CNI made so much sense to bring into the CNCF.
Got it. So how does security fit into all this? Oftentimes when you're hearing about networking, there's always this idea that are containers at the network layer secure? Are they secure enough? Like, how does this impact other sort of security measures that you might take? It seems like that would be a sort of a high priority concern.
Yeah, it definitely is. There is some, I guess, agreement across the industry that in general, software development is more secure as you limit that attack surface, or building things as a container limits that attack surface area, right? Now, that doesn't mean that just having a container makes you more secure. You still have to write your software in a way that surface area is not open to attack, right? And so there's still development needed and secure processes to keep in place when you're developing in cloud native, but decreasing that attack surface is important. The area that is really important now in cloud native that is just starting to be discussed is in the same way that when you looked at cloud computing many years ago, networking and security were some of the last components to move towards that cloud model, right? Security is just now kind of becoming more virtualized and more like cloud enabled, right? And we're automatically starting to change this now to cloud native and containers. And most security solutions don't understand containers today. They kind of operate at a layer below the container, but way above the container, and don't really understand that they have a set of services underneath them, right? And so one of my concerns, and it's a little bit off topic, but an example where I see a concern is like an IoT. As you have these services being registered automatically through like Kubernetes, how do you know that that service is really the service that it says it is? There's no way to validate that, right? There's no secrets, there's no security model or parameters in place to say, yes, this is a DNS service and it is the right one I'm connecting to, right? And so I think over time, you're going to see security evolving quite a bit in the cloud native space to address some of these, I guess, security by design is what I like to call it, aspects of when I connect into a interface, I'm going to validate that that's the right interface and that I'm not being, man in the middle attacked by some service that's ad hocly connecting into me.
Which is crazy. I mean, I think there's a lot of parallels between sort of that and like, what's happening just in general at the consumer level. There's a lot of crazy things happening with security. It seems like, there's some people that have sort of nefarious intent that seem to just almost stay a step ahead. I'm reading articles on security, even when it comes to clicking on links in like Twitter. Things that would seem relatively innocuous. And I've certainly gotten some suspect stuff from family members that I'm like, is your computer working? Did you really send me this? So I think it's always good to kind of think up that stuff sort of at the beginning. It's good that that the foundation is taking sort of measures so that it's not an afterthought, I guess.
Right. And we're taking it from the standpoint of open source projects today. So we're trying to work with the communities of interest that are doing open source projects, but we're not completely closed off to companies that have products in this space either. And so we have a landscape document on, if you go to GitHub, CNCF, you'll see that there's a landscape that we keep updating on GitHub that has a list of like security projects and products that we are interested in working with and trying to figure out how to make cloud native more secure. And so again, kind of different than like other foundations in the industry, we're not trying to go off and create a whole new security model. We're trying to take what the industry accepts as good security and working security today and help amplify that message and help integrate it with the other projects that are interested and that customers are having success with.
On the topic of just sort of, this is kind of related to what you're talking about. I got to give OpenStack a lot of credit. I mean, obviously, I probably I might be a little biased because I spent a lot of time in OpenStack, and in a lot of ways, I think OpenStack kind of sort of had to start from scratch when it comes to creating a massively scalable platform and collection of projects and a community, and they did a really good job, and they still continue to do a good job on the community end. But it sounds like they're almost a case study at this point. How do you think that? Where do you think OpenStack has fallen short in terms of? You mentioned Big Tent, but in a lot of ways, do you think that OpenStack is still on the right path?
I think the nice thing about OpenStack is it keeps correcting itself and working on making it better, right? And so I think Mark and the OpenStack board does a great job of listening to feedback, trying to adjust the way they're going forward. To me, where OpenStack has struggled recently is the industry is moving towards smaller containerized set of services, and OpenStack, as you know, is a bunch of big, large, monolithic services, right? And so, and the projects you have to kind of bundle together, and the complexity is difficult. And a lot of people ask me, why would I deploy OpenStack? Why would I not just jump straight to Kubernetes and just try to build my own, set of services? And the conversation is usually around there's a big difference between OpenStack projects and cloud native projects, and that cloud native projects sit within an OpenStack framework. They're not separate. They're not outside of it. They're not a whole new way of doing infrastructure. They're just a new way of developing applications, and they need to leverage the existing infrastructure, whether it's OpenStack or Microsoft or Amazon or any other cloud provider or any infrastructure that you have internally, right? You want it, kind of like I mentioned with CNI, you want to complement and integrate your existing deployments with cloud native models and methodologies and practices. You don't want to try to recreate the wheel and go off and build your own new set of capabilities. And so OpenStack is still very relevant, and there are a lot of large enterprises that want to run and operate their own private cloud or their own hybrid, destiny, right? And they're not going to feel comfortable putting everything out in the public cloud. And so I think that's where OpenStack has a great home. And what OpenStack has done recently is really listen to the community and trying to fit Kubernetes and cloud native patterns into OpenStack. And I think that's what's really important here, is that we figure out a way to integrate cloud native and Kubernetes with OpenStack versus trying to make them separate discussions.
So are we fighting for sort of, I'll say, control point mindshare? Like where should the control point be? Depending on who you talk to, it seems like, if you talk to networking folks, they think the control point is the network. If you talk to application folks, they want to be able to define their control point through their app or through the deployment tools that they're using for their app. But where does that control point, where should it live?
So I mean, there's several ways that you can kind of look at that question, Nikki. But I think in my mind, the control point almost always lives with the business and with who owns the P&L for the business, right? And so, yes, the infrastructure team is important. Yes, the networking team is important. and take that to the next level. Companies like Cisco and Arista and EMC are all very important in the future of where this industry is heading. There's no taking away from that. But I think we got to this point of a big divide between infrastructure and applications because the application team has a job to do, right? They're making money. They're trying to grow the business. The infrastructure team is a cost center, right? And they're basically trying to put processes and secure the infrastructure, help make sure that the company isn't going to put themselves at risk. And those two things collide with each other, right? When the infrastructure team is delaying a deployment of a very important application or an update to an application for very good reason. I'm not saying they have bad reasons for doing that, right? But when they hold it up and say, I need to go a change window on the second Thursday of the month to make this networking change so you can then deploy your application. The application team's like, that's bullshit. I can just go to Amazon and deploy it right now. I don't need you, right? You're slowing me down because you have this process that I don't care about and it doesn't help my business grow. And so we got to this over years, as you know, with infrastructure and admin, application teams fighting about this. And it's, to some extent, it's good that we got to this point because I think what I see with cloud native now, and what I want to kind of get to in this conversation with you is exactly that point of, there's a transition that's happening in the industry, and I don't think the infrastructure team is bad. I don't think the application team is bad, right? And there used to be a point in time, because I remember back in my IT days, where you would sit down in a room together with the architects and with the lead and developers, and you would figure out how to make this work the best, right? And we miss that now. And there are a lot of things you can do with infrastructure that the application teams have no idea about, right? And there's a lot of things that application teams can do that the infrastructure team has no idea about. And so if you're both kind of like ships in the night and you're both doing best practices and you never share those with each other, you end up with an inferior product in the marketplace. And that's where, to me, helping as a business to come together with your infrastructure team and with your application architects and say, how do we work together in a way that drives the business at most optimal speed with the least amount of risk that we can tolerate? And at the same time, how do you involve your networking team and your storage team and make them more, cloud native architects and make them more cloud native, solutions engineers that are solving problems and applying their vast knowledge of improvements and performance and security at that infrastructure layer to software development practices with, software defined networking, software defined storage, software defined whatever you want to call it, right? And how the application teams would know what interface, how do you define this API between the infrastructure team and the app team so that the app team doesn't have to worry about what storage vendor or what networking vendor you've deployed and what its specific interfaces are, right? It just knows interface up and I get a network, right? I need this DNS, boom, put it into the config and you get that DNS, right? And so the more automatic you can make that infrastructure responsive to the application requirements, and the more that infrastructure team understands the value that they bring to the application, I think those two worlds coming together is what this transformation is exciting for, because we're seeing that now. It's not just Ken off being crazy saying, why can't we all just get along, right? It's really, these two teams are coming together again and figuring out what's the best way to be successful as an organization versus silos that existed for many years now in IT and in the business that don't interoperate and don't share best practices and don't work well together. They're now breaking down those silos together. And that's what's really great about this whole transformation that we're seeing happen.
As far as this transformation goes, it definitely seems like, this isn't just the things that are impeding, I'll say the transition don't seem to be technology so much as it is culture and processes.
Right.
You talk to
people always talk about like technology, process, and the time, right? Those three things, right? Technology, process, and people. Those three things. I mean, so your people, you have to kind of start. My view is you have to start with your people, and you have to kind of lay out this vision for where you want to get to. And some people may not be able to come along that journey with you, right? That's not what you're hoping for. You're hoping that everyone gets on board and says, "Let's go," right? But you have to be honest with your teams and with your individuals and make sure that they're ready for this transformation. And then the process, like I've mentioned multiple times in presentations, we have processes in place for good reason, right? I think application teams are younger now, and so they don't realize that, there's been lots of big problems that have happened in the internet because process didn't exist, right? And so the problem is that process was defined 10, 15 years ago, and nobody's ever gone back to look at that process and see, is it still valid today? Or probably better question is, how do I modify this process to be more supportive of what we're trying to do today? And so I hate to say this, but I have told enterprises to kind of go back and question every process and every procedure and try to understand not why they have it, but how does it apply to me today? Is this outdated and useless procedure? What was the intent behind this procedure? Is that intent still valid going forward? Okay, how do we make that intent relevant for today? And then put that into some type of a CI/CD pipeline so that you're continuously evolving and continuously looking at those processes in every iteration you do. And if that process needs to be updated or changed, it becomes part of your development cycle, not an afterthought, or not oh, we forgot about this process and now it's 10 years again and we have the same problem we have today, right? And you laugh, but we've seen this happen so many times. People forget why they do something, and it becomes a hindrance to moving forward. And then no one can tell you why, because the person who wrote it has been gone for 10 years and no one knows why he wrote it in the first place, but we have to follow it, and so.
I think that's applicable not only just to, I'll say, like, development of apps and infrastructure, but I think it affects most organizations in other areas. I definitely seen, there's always departments, and it seems like the older the company, the harder it is to shift. But when it comes to sort of control and policies, and really what they're trying to do is avert risk and make sure that there's not a bunch of rogue stuff going on. And one example we were talking about it before was, you guys are using the DevNet Create site has a site on Medium, right? And you've made the decision to sort of kind of pull that off of the Cisco.com domain, but use Medium instead. What was the driver behind that decision? And how do you make, folks who may not agree that's the right thing to do, how do you get them comfortable with that type of decision?
Yeah, definitely. Well, the decision to move to Medium in the case with like DevNet was, I think it started with, we want to have a focus on a developer audience. And so for those of you who don't know Cisco DevNet, we are a group within Cisco engineering team that is focused on developers and what developers are trying to do in the multiple different areas that Cisco functions in, right? And so Cisco is one of these large, as Nikki mentioned, very large companies, and we have IoT, we have collaboration, we have networking switches and routers and access points, and you could go on for 20 minutes on all the networking stuff we have, right? And we have security solutions. We have, different businesses and different verticals, like in the government and in healthcare and in finance. And so we are a very large company, but across all of that is a focus on how do we enable developers to leverage Cisco solutions through our APIs and through our networking interfaces to do what I kind of mentioned earlier. How do we make it easier to do unique performance, to kind of differentiate yourself from your competitor? How do we make it easier for you to take advantage of advances that Cisco's made in networking and security to improve your product availability and your product's performance so that you can outshine against your competition? And so DevNet started out just 3 years ago, if you can believe that. It's a very young group within the environment of Cisco, and we work with all the businesses across Cisco to sort of enable easy integrations. We have sandboxes and learning labs. You can learn about technology, you can get hands-on and use the technology and understand how to use the APIs. And so DevNet is trying to focus on this specific audience that doesn't go to Cisco.com, right? And so we could have kept using Cisco.com, but we would never reach the audience we're trying to reach. And so the business decision was made to move to where our audience is, which is on Medium. And so we moved our blogging and our content to Medium and started publishing and promoting what we're doing on Medium. And we've had tremendous response, much more followers on Medium than we ever had on Cisco.com. And it's not because Cisco.com is bad or not. I mean, don't take that I'm saying that Cisco.com couldn't reach that audience. It's just that audience doesn't go to Cisco.com, but they do go to Medium. And now we're able to kind of cross link things into Cisco.com, and Cisco.com can post that we're doing things on Medium, and we're kind of bringing those groups together now. And the philosophy is that if we bring the two groups together, you're going to get growth in both Cisco.com visits and DevNet community, because you're driving more and more users to look at what Cisco's doing in this space.
So I had Tim Crawford on the podcast. He's a well-known cloud guy. And he was making a point just in general about the fact that, the companies are always eager to go and market to CIOs. And I think in a lot of ways, there's a lot of companies out there that want to go market to developers, but that's really like, I don't see the words marketing and developers.
They don't go together.
Yeah.
They don't.
First of all, why is that?
I think the main reason is, developers, I think of developers in two ways. There's the ones that I think you and I are thinking about the most, which are the guys that are heads down.
Or
they're
gals,
writing code.
To be fair.
Right, or gals, right? Guys and girls that are heads down writing code, and they don't look up, they don't communicate with other people around them other than their team, right? And they're just focused on driving revenue in the business, right? And then you have the other group of developer guys and gals I look at are more of the architects. They kind of look across the industry. They try to understand trends. They look at open source projects, what are other people doing, and they try to bring that into the heads down developers that are just writing code all day long and love to write code, right? And so as you look at these guys and gals, they're not interested in what the market is trying to tell them, right? They know what the market needs. They know what they're working on. They're looking at what's happening around them, and they're trying to figure out how to take advantage of that. They don't have time, or do they want to have someone come in and tell them what they should be thinking? So I think to your first question, that developers don't have the time of day for marketing, because it just wastes their cycles, and they don't have time to waste cycles.
But if you could, Google something and end up on a DevNet site and it has a snippet of code or a pro tip of some kind, then that becomes valuable, right?
Right, and I think that's a difference in what I was mentioning before, as I didn't say we were marketing to the developers, we're trying to reach the developers by going to where they are, right? And so to your point, if we can provide relevance and content, and they pick up that content in their day-to-day searching for how do I configure X or Y, or what's the right way to, how I have this Cisco product, how would I write code to make that Cisco product do something, they're going to find us on Medium, because that's where they're searching, right? And they're going to be happy that they found us, because we're going to have sample code, we're going to have examples of how to do it and what else you can do with that device that they can then take and use right away without having to reach out to Cisco or ask Cisco for help. They can just take what we provide and just go with it, right?
I see it very much an exercise in efficiency. Like it seems like developers are going to go wherever they can get the fastest, most complete, most reliable answer for the question that they have that doesn't involve reaching out to a bunch of people and waiting.
Yep. I was joking with a couple of my friends a couple of weeks ago at one of the conferences I was at, one of the DevNet, not DevNet, sorry, at DockerCon, right? I was talking with a couple of my friends, and we were kind of commenting how we haven't written any fresh code in years, right? We write code all day long, but we pretty much almost always Google something, find something that's close to what we are trying to do, and then we start with something that's already been done. We don't try to reinvent it ourselves, right? And so I don't think that's the common for, like, I'm not trying to put down application developers, because I know they're inventing new code all the time, and they do a great job of inventing code. But to your point, if they're trying to figure out how to take their new invention and work with something that's like a Cisco product, they don't want to invent that. They want to go borrow some code that's been written, or have ideas of snippets of code that have been successful in doing what they want to do. And that you're absolutely right. It's all about efficiency and the least amount of time it takes to get product out the door.
Which arguably is happening on the consumer end. I mean, I think about all my favorite apps that I use, and all the apps that I download are ones that are gonna save me time or make my life easier, or help me accomplish whatever I need to accomplish the fastest. Like I used to drive to the store to get stuff scanned and faxed. And then I found like this Scanner Pro app, and I'm like, oh my gosh, what a life changer. I can do all this from my phone. I don't need to, go through this process of like hooking up a fax machine or wondering if
and this might be for like another discussion time, right? Because I think you're onto something really important here. And I watch my kids, and I think your kid is too young for this, but my kids, they're all about the games and how they can waste more time by downloading stupid things on their phone. And so like the different, I guess the point I'm trying to get is that the difference between like us and people who don't have jobs or kids, right, is there's a different view of what they can do with applications and how applications can make their lives better versus like you and I want to be more efficient. They want to just waste time and have fun, right? And I think that culture, going back to your security question, I bring it up because I think that culture is why we're in some of the security concerns we have today, is that group, that generation is growing up not worried about privacy, not worried about security, just worried about what can I do to have fun? How can I make this more fun for me? And that group is coming into the workforce now. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see how that mindset that has shifted from more about efficiency to more about how do I get pleasure in what I'm doing, right? That's going to be a major shift, I think, over the next decade that we should be watching closely.
Well, I'll tell you what, if everything is as good as avocado toast, then millennials need to bring it, because I've been on an avocado toast kick. I've been posting pictures of all my avocado toast inventions, and I'm like, man, these millennials had it right. It's like, where has this been my whole life?
Yeah, they have a lot of great ideas and a lot of good things for sure.
It's a different perspective, most definitely. I mean, growing up, I don't think I was really exposed to technology until I was like, in my teens, for sure. We didn't have all these cool, iPads and games to play with.
I always joke with my wife, when she was in medical school, I was in engineering school, and we would use IRC to chat with each other. And I was explaining to my kids what IRC is. I was like, it's original instant messaging, except you type something and you had no idea if it got there. And you just waited and waited and waited, and about 10 minutes later you get something back, and then you would type another message and wait and wait and wait. So 5 or 6 text messages would take you an hour because you had no idea if it got there. You had to wait forever for a response.
One thing that I'm surprised hasn't gone out of that hasn't come back in fashion is like walkie-talkies. When I worked, I in a previous life I worked in construction. We all had Nextel phones, and you call your builder and say, hey, you got a broken ceiling fan, blah, 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 and, beep, beep, 10-4, that was pretty handy. I guess we have text messaging now, which is probably a lot less disruptive to the people that are around you.
My kids like using like Snapchat, right? They take a stupid picture and send it to someone. That's the way they communicate now.
Ephemeral communication, which is wild. It's just absolutely wild. I just devised this great plan. Speaking of technology, with my kid, I'm trying to get him to learn how to spell stuff and get better at writing and spelling. And so I was like, man, how can I do this like over the summer? And so I had this great plan to set him up with the Minecraft account, and then I'll set up a Minecraft account and join his game and send him messages. And he thought it was like the coolest thing ever. He's like, hey, you wrote me, I'm gonna write you back. But I learned how to type from Telnet chat, so I figure like I could probably use this technology to my favor to help my kid out a little bit. Oh my, how times have changed. So switching gears, you obviously talk to a lot of companies. It's one thing that you absolutely love doing, and I'm sure you talk to people who are one of my customers in a talk we gave called, old school and new school folks, and you kind of see where these sort of worlds are colliding. But especially with regards to, like, I'll say Cisco's traditional customer base, how are people and companies evolving towards this cloud native model? I mean, they're not going to just get rid of their old stuff overnight, but like the evolution is inevitable at this point, I think. And it seems like a lot of companies are struggling with this.
Yeah, there's a lot of confusion and a lot of frustration in the companies I talk to, because I've heard some CIOs and kind of VPs of infrastructure say, we just had figured out cloud, and now this whole cloud native thing is coming, right? And so it's interesting from that regard. But to answer your question more directly, right, what I'm seeing being successful is starting with small projects. And it's no different than with any time in the past and how you'd kind of take on new technology, right? But the difference that I'm pushing it, and when I talk with customers, is when you do this new project, think about what are the people as impacts, and what are the process impacts, and what are the technology impacts. Because when you think of new technology, you think of like containers and you think of Kubernetes, and they are new technologies, but you also have existing new technologies that you probably just implemented in your enterprise, right? And maybe something like MuleSoft isn't new to everyone, but it might be new to your enterprise. And so how do you leverage a message bus that is taking care of a lot of your enterprise back office stuff with Kubernetes? How do you integrate those two message and distributed orchestration solutions simultaneously? Do they replace each other? Do they overlap? Do you integrate them? So I try to help enterprise customers understand that it's a journey, and you have to start with helping your people see how they fit into the direction you're going, helping figure out which processes are going to be impacted by this new model of development that is going to take over. As you and I both know, it's taken over already, so it's going to continue to grow. But probably most importantly, how do you look at the impact that it has on your existing technologies, and how do you integrate, or how do you maybe you have a project that's like a 6-month or 8-month, I'm going to move off of this SAP Oracle 11 database, right? How do you take a new project that is going to take you multiple years, and how do you table that project and rescope it to be more of a cloud native model? And what would be the impacts of doing that? What would be the benefits? What would be the drawbacks? What processes would be completely useless when you did that? And what processes would you need to create when you do that? Because obviously a database that has personal information, and it's not something you just haphazardly throw away, right? And so there's a lot when you start thinking about real projects and real aspects of what you're trying to do. It becomes a lot more real to you than just saying, I'm going to build, a pet store app on my laptop and see how this technology can help me, right? Because no one builds a pet store app on their laptop, So pick something real, pick something that really is going to make a difference and help you understand the impact that it can or cannot have on what you're trying to do. And what I like to tell my kids is, take a tough problem and try to solve it. And if when you do that, you may not solve the problem the way you thought you were going to solve it, but you're going to learn so much about what you're trying to do by taking on a tough problem.
It seems like that's a trait, I'll say, of people that I've seen sort of make these successful career transitions, is that they're the type of people that love to learn and take it upon themselves to learn and to explore and to try things. And, people aren't afraid to break things. And if there was one thing that I would want my kid to learn, for sure, it's not like, hey, it's not always what it's, your passion for knowing, probably
right.
More than anything else.
Yeah,
so
definitely.
We just blew through 45 minutes, which is crazy. That was fast. Serverless is coming into the picture.
Come back, Nikki.
I would love you to come back. We can talk about the serverless things. You said that people are just now wrapping their heads around cloud, and now that they've gone from traditional infrastructure to virtualization, and now they're doing cloud, which still has servers, but now you're talking about serverless, and I think people's heads are exploding. So I'd love to read more about that and have you back on to talk about that.
Definitely.
Where are you going to be in the next few months? Where can we find you?
So I'm going to be at the OpenStack Summit in LA coming up in a couple months, and then I will be at
OpenStack Summit?
Open Source Summit, sorry.
Open Source Summit,
Open Source Summit, yeah, in LA.
The next OpenStack Summit's in Australia, in Sydney. So.
Australia, yep.
Yeah.
I've been looking at that, but I'll definitely be at the Open Source Summit, and I'll be at the Cloud Native Con, KubeCon in Austin later this year.
Yay! You'll have to call me. We'll have to hang out.
Definitely.
You can check out DevNet Create. The blog is at medium.com/@DevNetCreate. You can find Ken on Twitter at Ken Owens 12 with one N.
Yep.
Correct?
Correct.
Where else can we find you? The DevNet site just has a ton of stuff on it, which is super awesome. And
I'm on LinkedIn at Ken Owens 12 as well. So
LinkedIn, who uses that? No, I'm just kidding. I use it too. it seems like the DevNet folks, just in general, one thing I found consistent amongst the DevNet crew is that they're so helpful. Like they're always willing to help. And they usually respond to stuff super fast, which is super handy. But yeah, look for Ken online. Check out DevNet Create. Subscribe. If you haven't subscribed, we'd love to hear your comments, feedbacks. If you have an idea for a guest, let me know. Hopefully I'll be back with Ballard next week. So Ken, thank you so much for your time. I hope
thanks for having me.
We'll tune in later and we'll definitely get you back on the show, Ken.
Cool. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.